The wind in Montana doesn't just blow, it screams. It's a jagged, freezing howl that rips through the canyons of the Glacier National Forest, carrying the scent of ancient pine and impending storms. Inside her gray Ford Raptor, Sierra Vance gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, not from the cold, but from the habit of tension. The windshield wipers fought a rhythmic, losing battle against the heavy slush. Thwack thwack, thwack thwack. To anyone else, it was just a noise. To Sierra, it sounded like the steady, agonizing heartbeat of a man bleeding out in the dust of the Helmand province. She was 29 years old, but her eyes, a pale, predatory green, looked like they had seen the end of the world and decided not to tell anyone about it. Her dark hair was pulled back into a utilitarian ponytail, tight enough to hurt. On the passenger seat sat her life's new alibi, a Pelican 1535 aircase. Inside wasn't a precision rifle, but a Canon EOS R3 with a 600mm f/4L as 3 lens. To the world, Sierra was a high-end wildlife photographer specializing in elusive subjects in extreme terrain. It was the perfect cover because it wasn't entirely a lie. She was still hunting, she just wasn't pulling a trigger anymore. Or so she told herself every morning when she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. As she crested a ridge overlooking the valley where FOB Sentinel lay nestled like a gray scar on the white landscape, her hand instinctively moved toward the center console. She wasn't reaching for her phone. Her fingers were searching for a radio, for a Kestrel 5700 wind meter, for the cold steel of a bolt handle. When she realized what she was doing, she forced her hand back to the wheel. 5 years. Sierra, she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. You're just a wife visiting her husband. That's it. But the moral injury, that's what the shrinks at the VA called it, didn't care about the passage of time. Moral injury isn't PTSD. It isn't just about fear. It's about the soul-crushing weight of doing something that violates your deeply held beliefs, or, in Sierra's case, the weight of not being allowed to do what was necessary. Her mind drifted, unbidden, back to the heat, back to the day of dust in Kabul. August 2020. The air in Kabul had been a thick soup of jet fuel, human desperation, and fine, alkaline dust that coated the back of your throat like powdered glass. Sierra had been perched in the crow's nest, a crumbling clock tower overlooking a narrow choke point near the airport's north gate. Beside her, Corporal Danny Reeves, her spotter, was hunched over the spotting scope. Danny was 21, had a kid back in Ohio he'd never met, and possessed the best eyes in the unit. Ghost, I got eyes on the high-value target, Danny had whispered, his voice cracking with adrenaline, confirming identity. It's him, Viktor The Vulture Volkov. 800 yards, center of the plaza. Sierra had settled behind her MK13 Mod 7. The rifle felt like a part of her skeletal system. She had dialed the Night Force ATAC R for elevation, 18.5 MOA up. She'd accounted for the crosswind blowing left to right at 10 knots. The reticle rested perfectly on Volkov's chest. The Vulture, a former Spetsnaz turned mercenary. The man responsible for the IEDs that had turned 3rd Platoon into a memory. I have the shot, Sierra had said, her breathing slowing into the sniper's zen. Her heart rate dropped to 45 beats per minute. Between heartbeats, the world stood still, requesting permission to engage. The radio crackled. The voice from command was cold, detached, and 3 miles away. Negative. Shadow 1. Stand down. We are in a no fire window to facilitate diplomatic egress. Do not engage. Sir, Sierra hissed, her finger taking up the 2-pound slack on the trigger. He's coordinating a mortar team. If I don't take him now, the gate is going to get hammered. Stand down, Ghost. That is an order. Political considerations take precedence. Out. Sierra watched through the glass. She watched Volkov raise a hand. She watched him drop it. 30 seconds later, the first mortar hit the crowded canal. The sound was a dull thump, followed by a roar that Sierra felt in her teeth. Then came the screaming. Danny Reeves had stood up, reaching for his med kit, shouting something she couldn't hear over the secondary explosions. A piece of shrapnel the size of a deck of cards had caught Danny in the neck. Sierra had dropped her rifle and lunged for him. her hands disappearing into the hot, bright crimson of his carotid spray. She had tried to hold his life inside him, her thumbs pressed deep into his throat, screaming for a corpsman who would never arrive in time. Danny's eyes had locked onto hers, confused, terrified, and then, empty. She had been ordered to watch. She had been ordered to let the monster live. And in that silence, Sierra Vance had died, and the ghost had been born. The raptor hit a pothole, jarring Sierra back to the present. The Montana snow was a stark contrast to the Afghan dust, but the feeling in her chest was the same, a hollow, aching void. She pulled up to the gate of FOB Sentinel. The kid on guard duty, a corporal named Miller, looked bored. He had his rifle slung over his shoulder like a piece of luggage, the muzzle clogged with light snow. Sierra's eyes mapped the scene instantly. Low alertness, poor spacing. Guard shack has no reinforced glass. The North Ridge offers a 420-foot elevation advantage with zero counter sniper overwatch. She hated her brain for doing it. She hated that she couldn't see a landscape without seeing a kill zone. "State your business, ma'am," Miller said, leaning toward her window. "Sierra Vance, here to see Captain Grant Vance," she said, handing over her military spouse ID. The kid glanced at it, then at her Raptor. "Nice truck. You're the photographer, right? The captain mentioned you were coming. A bit early, aren't you?" The light was right. Sierra lied smoothly. "Well, welcome to the middle of nowhere. Mrs. Vance, drive safe. These roads are treacherous." "You have no idea what treacherous looks like, kid," she thought as the gate hummed open. She drove through the compound, her eyes cataloging the decay. Sentinel was a low-priority post. The Humvees looked like they hadn't seen a mechanic in months. The perimeter fence was sagging under the weight of the snow. It was a base forgotten by the Pentagon, manned by soldiers who thought their biggest enemy was boredom. She parked in front of the command trailer and stepped out. The cold hit her like a physical blow. A sharp, revitalizing pain. She grabbed her camera bag, the false bottom containing her old dope card and a ballistics calculator she couldn't bring herself to throw away, and headed inside. Grant was standing over a topographic map, looking older than he had 3 months ago. When he saw her, the weary lines around his eyes vanished, replaced by a genuine, warm smile. He moved across the room and pulled her into a hug. He smelled like cheap coffee and CLP, gun oil. To Sierra, it was the smell of home and the smell of the grave all at once. "You're early, Shadow," he whispered into her hair. He was the only one allowed to use that nickname. He thought it was because she was quiet. He didn't know it was her call sign. "Missed you," she said, burying her face in his shoulder. It was a half-truth. She had missed him, but she had also run north because the ghosts in her apartment in San Diego were getting too loud. "The timing is actually perfect," Grant said, pulling back. "We've got a legend on base. A retired colonel named Silas Cross. He's here doing some consulting on our long-range defenses. You'd like him. He's a bit of a grouch, but he talks about optics and angles as much as you do." Sierra felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the Montana wind. She knew the name Silas Cross. Every sniper in the community knew it. He was a Vietnam-era relic, a man who had more confirmed kills than some entire battalions. "Silas Cross is here?" she asked, her voice steady. "Yeah, in the mess hall. Come on, I'll buy you a cardboard-flavored coffee and introduce you." As they walked across the snow-dusted tarmac, Sierra looked up at the North Ridge. The sun was dipping low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the peaks. To a photographer, it was the golden hour. To a scout sniper, it was the perfect time for an insertion. She looked at the ridgeline and saw a movement, just a flicker of white against the dark bark of a pine tree. Most people would have dismissed it as a bird or a falling clump of snow. Sierra stopped dead, her pupils dilated, her breathing hitched. "Sierra, you okay?" Grant asked, sensing her sudden shift. She didn't answer. She was calculating. Distance, 650 yards. Angle, 15 degrees. Wind, variable, 5 to 8 miles per hour. The movement didn't happen again. But Sierra knew. You don't spend 6 years as a ghost without learning how to spot another one. The storm wasn't just coming from the clouds. It was already on the ridge. And for the first time in 5 years, Sierra Vance didn't feel like a photographer. She felt like a hunter who had forgotten her rifle. The mess hall of FOB Sentinel was a drab, rectangular box that smelled of floor wax and over-steeped Lipton tea. It was filled with the low-frequency hum of young men and women who were thousands of miles away from home and bored out of their minds. To them, the base was a cage. To Sierra, it was a target, and a poorly defended one at that. "Sierra, this is Colonel Silas Cross," Grant said, gesturing to a man sitting alone at a corner table. Silas Cross didn't look like a legend. He looked like a piece of old hickory, weathered, gnarled, and impossibly tough. He was in his late 60s, with a buzz cut the color of a winter sky and hands that looked like they'd spent half a century gripping iron. He didn't look up from his coffee immediately. He was staring at the steam rising from his mug as if he were calculating its drift. "Colonel," Grant said, "my wife, Sierra, she's the photographer I told you about." Silas finally looked up. His eyes weren't the fading blue of an old man, they were the sharp, piercing gray of a hawk. He didn't look at her face, he looked at her posture. He looked at the way she stood, balanced, weight on the balls of her feet, eyes scanning the exits before settling on him. "Photographer, huh?" Silas's voice was a low growl, like gravel shifting in a stream. He didn't offer a hand. He just watched her. "You shoot digital or film?" "Digital for the speed, film for the soul," Sierra replied, her voice steady. "Takes a steady hand to shoot long-distance wildlife," Silas remarked. "Lot of patience, lot of breath control." The air between them suddenly felt thin. It was a test. Sierra knew that tone. It was the tone of a master recognizing a student who had wandered far from the dojo. "Patience is the only thing that doesn't cost money in this business, Colonel," Sierra said. Grant, oblivious to the subtext, laughed. "I'll leave you two artists to talk shop. I've got to check in with the motor pool. One of our Humvees decided to die in the middle of the gate shift." As Grant walked away, the silence at the table became heavy. Silas took a slow sip of his coffee. "Your husband is a good man, Sierra," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. "Dedicated officer, but he sees the world in maps and logistics. He doesn't see the thrum." Sierra sat down across from him. "The thrum?" "The vibration the world makes when it's about to break," Silas said. He leaned forward, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "I've been on this rock for 2 months. 2 months of sensor malfunctions and atmospheric interference. They tell me it's the snow. They tell me the coyotes are tripping the perimeter wires." "And what do you tell them?" "I tell them coyotes don't move in 3-man fire teams with staggered spacing." Silas hissed. "I tell them sensors don't go dark in a perfect sequence unless someone knows exactly where the dead zones are." Sierra felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "I saw movement on the North Ridge 10 minutes ago. White on white, high elevation." Silas didn't blink. He just nodded slowly. "I saw it too. 5 o'clock hours this morning. They're ranging us, Sierra. They're checking the dope on their rifles. They're waiting for the ceiling to drop." "Who?" "Doesn't matter who," Silas said, though they both knew. The chatter on the encrypted frequencies had been leaning toward Eastern European signatures. "What matters is that this base is a glasshouse. And someone is holding a very large rock." After her talk with Silas, Sierra couldn't stay inside. The domestic comfort of the command trailer felt like a shroud. She put on her tactical cold weather parka, grabbed her camera bag, and headed out for what she called a scouting trip for light. In reality, it was a combat patrol. She walked the perimeter fence, her boots crunching in the fresh powder. She wasn't looking at the scenery. She was looking at the avenue of approach. FOB Sentinel was situated in a natural bowl. To the north, the ridge rose steeply, a sniper's paradise. To the south, a lower, rockier outcrop offered a secondary vantage point. If an assault came, it would come from the north, supported by heavy fire from the south. It was a classic pincer. She stopped at Gate 3. The corporal from earlier, Miller, was leaning against a post, looking at his phone. "Find any elusive subjects yet, Mrs. Vance?" he asked. Not looking up. "Just shadows," Sierra said. She stepped closer to the perimeter sensors, small, boxy units mounted on the fence posts. She noticed a fine layer of ice over the infrared lens of one. But it wasn't just ice. It looked like it had been sprayed with something. She reached out and rubbed a finger over the lens. It was oily. Silicone spray. It was an old trick. Distort the lens just enough to trigger a low visibility error in the software, forcing the operators to lower the sensitivity or ignore the alarms entirely. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. This wasn't a glitch. This was sabotage. She looked up at the North Ridge again. The clouds were rolling in fast now. A heavy, slate-gray blanket that would swallow the mountain in less than an hour. In sniper terms, it was a low-light, high-moisture environment. It meant the air was dense. It meant the bullets would fly slower but hit harder. It meant windage would be a nightmare for anyone who hadn't spent 1,000 hours reading the Mirage. She pulled her ballistics calculator from her bag. She didn't turn it on, but she felt the buttons under her thumb. Density altitude, 4,500 feet. Humidity, 85%. Temp, 22 degrees. She ran the math in her head for a .300 Win Mag, the round used by her old MK13. At 700 yards, the drop would be nearly 120 inches. You'd have to aim at the sky just to hit the ground. "Mrs. Vance, you okay? You're staring at that hill like it owes you money," Miller said, finally putting his phone away. "Corporal," Sierra said, her voice turning sharp, the voice of a sergeant of Marines. "When was the last time the techs checked these sensors?" Miller blinked, taken aback by her tone. 2 days ago? Why? Tell your sergeant to get a cleaning kit out here. Now. And tell him to check for silicon residue." "Ma'am, I don't think. I didn't ask what you think." "Miller, look at the North Ridge. Look at the tree line. See that gap in the pines? That's a perfect overwatch position. If I were up there with a CheyTac M200, I could put a bullet through your coffee cup before you heard the crack." Miller looked at the ridge, then back at the photographer. For the first time, he saw past the civilian clothes. He saw the cold, calculated lethality in her eyes. He straightened his posture, his slung rifle suddenly feeling heavy. I'll tell the sergeant, ma'am." Sierra headed back toward the motor pool, her mind racing. She needed to see Silas again. He was the only one who wouldn't think she was crazy. She found him behind the supply shed, leaning against a rusted crates of ammunition. He was holding something wrapped in an oily rag. As Sierra approached, he unwrapped it just enough for her to see the bolt-action assembly of a precision rifle. "You weren't just walking for the light," Silas said. "It wasn't a question." "The sensors are being sprayed," Sierra said. "Someone's prepping the kill zone." Silas sighed, a sound of weary confirmation. "I tried to tell Grant. I tried to tell the major. They think I'm a fossil living in the 90s. They think electronic warfare is the only threat. We need to get the men on high alert," Sierra said. "And say what?" "That a photographer and a retiree have a feeling." Silas shook his head. "They won't listen until the first mortar tube pops. And by then, it'll be too late for half the kids on this base." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Grant doesn't know, does he? About the ghost?" Sierra looked away, toward the gray horizon. "I promised him. I told him Kabul was the end. I told him I'd buried that part of me." "You can bury a rifle." "Sierra, you can't bury a gift," Silas said. He reached into the rag and pulled out a small, brass object, a .300 Winchester Magnum casing. "I've got a cache on the South Ridge. An MK13 Mod 7. It's zeroed for this altitude. It's got a Schmidt and Bender scope with a Tremor 3 reticle. It's a beautiful piece of machinery." He held the casing out to her. "I can't climb that ridge alone. Sierra, my knees are shot, and my eyes aren't what they used to be at 800 yards. I can be the spotter. I can call the wind. But I need a shooter." Sierra looked at the brass casing. It glinted in the dying light. A small, golden promise of violence. If she took it, the lie was over. If she took it, she was no longer a wife, a photographer, or a civilian. She was a weapon. And if she didn't take it, Grant was dead. "The wind is picking up," Sierra said, her voice barely a whisper. "Coming from the northwest, maybe 12 knots. 13, Silas corrected, "and it's gusting. You'll need to hold 3 minutes of angle for windage if you want to hit anything center mass." Sierra reached out. Her fingers closed over the brass. The metal was cold, but it felt like fire in her palm. The thrum was no longer a vibration in the air. It was a roar in her blood. "Where's the cash?" she asked. Silas smiled. A grim, toothy grin that looked like a scar opening up. "South Ridge. Trailhead starts behind the fuel depot. We go at 1 o'clock. We'll be in position before the sun even thinks about coming up." Sierra looked back at the command trailer, where the lights were warm and her husband was safe. For now, she thought about Danny Reeves. She thought about the "no fire" order. She thought about the Vulture. "Viktor Volkov," she said. Silas froze. "You think it's him?" "I don't think," Sierra said, her green eyes turning to ice. "I know. He's been following me for 5 years. He didn't come for the base. Silas. He came for the ghost." The snow began to fall in earnest then, thick, silent flakes that covered the world in a shroud of white. The storm was here, and as Sierra Vance walked toward the darkness, she knew that by dawn, the only thing left of her life would be the spent brass in the snow. The world at 1 a.m. was a vacuum of sound and light. In the command trailer, the only noise was the rhythmic, peaceful breathing of Grant Vance. Sierra stood over him for a long minute, her silhouette a dark smudge against the dim glow of the heater's pilot light. She looked at his face, relaxed, trusting, the face of a man who believed the woman he loved was just a photographer who occasionally had bad dreams. The guilt tasted like copper in her mouth. She was breaking a 5-year vow. She was stepping back into the shadow. And she knew, with the cold certainty of a terminal diagnosis, that once she crossed that line tonight, she might never find her way back to being just Sierra again. She leaned down and pressed a ghost of a kiss to his forehead. "I'm doing this so you can wake up tomorrow," she whispered. She slipped out the door, her movements fluid and soundless. She was dressed in layers of merino wool and high-performance Gore-Tex. Charcoal gray to blend into the pre-dawn gloom. She bypassed the main lights of the compound, moving through the dead zones she'd mapped earlier. The snow was falling in fine, crystalline needles now, the kind that didn't just coat the ground but bit into the skin. Silas was waiting behind the fuel depot, a shadow among shadows. He didn't say a word. He just handed her a ruck, heavy, dense, packed with ammunition, water, and thermal blankets. He shouldered his own gear with a grunt of suppressed pain. "South Ridge Trail," Silas murmured, his breath a white plume in the dark. "It's a goat path, steep, icy, and unforgiving, just like the rest of this life. Lead the way, Colonel." The climb was a brutal exercise in lung-burning endurance. The South Ridge wasn't as high as the North, but it was a jagged spine of granite and shale that felt like it was actively trying to shed them. Every step was a calculation. Don't kick the loose stone. Watch the ice under the fresh powder. Control the breath. For Sierra, the physical pain was a relief. It grounded her. It pushed the faces of the dead, Danny Reeves, the civilians at the North Gate, back into the recesses of her mind. This was blood memory. Her muscles remembered the tension of a tactical ascent. Her heart remembered how to beat in the thin, freezing air of a high-altitude overwatch. Silas, despite his bad knees, moved with the grim efficiency of an old wolf. He didn't waste motion. He didn't complain, but Sierra could hear the hitch in his joints, the way his breath came in ragged stabs. He was a man out of time, fighting one last war because he didn't know how to do anything else. 2 hours later, they reached the shelf. It was a natural depression in the rock, shielded by a stand of stunted, wind-blasted pines. From here, they had a clear, unobstructed line of sight across the valley to the North Ridge and a top-down view of FOB Sentinel. Below them, the base looked like a toy set, tiny lights, tiny fences, tiny lives. "Here," Silas whispered, kneeling in the snow. He reached into a crevice shielded by a heavy tarp and pulled out a long, hard shell case. Sierra's hands drifted toward it, then hesitated. Her fingers trembled. This was it, the point of no return. Silas noticed. "It's just a tool, Sierra. Gravity, wind, and math don't give it more power than it has. It's never just a tool, Silas. It's a choice." She unlatched the case. The sound of the snaps, clack-clack, echoed like gunshots in the quiet. There it was, The MK13 Mod 7. It was a masterpiece of military engineering. Built on a Remington 700 long action and nestled in an Accuracy International AX chassis. It was chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. The tan Cerakote finish was worn at the edges, showing the honest silver of the steel beneath. Mounted on top was a Nightforce ATAC R5 to 25 by 56 mm scope. A piece of glass so clear it felt like cheating. Sierra reached down and lifted the rifle. The weight was familiar, 13 pounds of purposeful balance. The cold of the chassis seeped through her gloves. But it felt like a homecoming. She ran her hand over the bolt handle, her fingers tracing the knurling. She felt the texture of the pistol grip. The way the cheek riser was perfectly positioned for her eye level. "She's zeroed for 100 yards at this altitude," Silas said, pulling a Kestrel 5700 Elite Ballistics weather meter from his pocket. "I've kept the CLP fresh. The barrel is a Lelia match grade. 1 in 10 twist. She likes the 220 grain Sierra Matchking rounds." Sierra worked the bolt. The action was smooth, a metallic zip click that spoke of tight tolerances and obsessive maintenance. She peered through the Nightforce glass. Even in the dim starlight, the MIL-R reticle stood out with surgical precision. "Check the turrets," Silas instructed. "I've got the elevation dialed to 0. The windage is neutral. We'll need to build our dope card before the sun breaks." Sierra settled into the prone position, the snow biting into her chest. She adjusted the bipod, digging the feet into the frozen earth. She looked through the scope toward the North Ridge, roughly 750 yards away. "Ranging the North Ridge treeline," she said, her voice shifting into a professional monotone. "I've got a prominent rock formation at 720 yards. Another cluster of pines at 785. Silas was already on his spotting scope, a Leupold Mark IV with a honeycomb kill flash. "Copy. Wind is coming from our 7 o'clock. Moving toward the North Ridge. Call it 8 to 10 miles per hour. Consistent. But that valley floor is a wind tunnel. Sierra, expect a 2 MOA shift in the mid-flight of the bullet." MOA, minute of angle. At 800 yards, 1 MOA was roughly 8 inches. A 2 MOA shift meant the wind could push her bullet 16 inches off target. In the world of high-stakes shooting, 16 inches was the difference between a neutralized threat and a wasted shot that gave away their position. "I need to check the cold bore theory," Sierra murmured. "Not yet," Silas warned. "The first shot is the only one that matters. And we can't afford the acoustic signature. We rely on the math. Look at the Kestrel." Sierra glanced at the digital screen. Density altitude, 4,820. Barometric pressure, 24.85. Humidity, 82%. "The air is heavy, Silas. It's going to drag the round down faster than your charts say." "Adjust for it then. You're the ghost. Use your gut." Sierra closed her eyes for a second, feeling the wind on her cheek. She was visualizing the bullet's flight. A .30 caliber piece of lead and copper exiting the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second. Fighting the dense, freezing air, arcing through the sky, and succumbing to the invisible hand of gravity. She opened her eyes and began to dial the turrets. Click, click, click. The tactile feedback was crisp. She adjusted for the upward angle of the shot. The Coriolis effect was negligible at this range. But the high-angle math wasn't. "I'm dialed for 750, she said, holding half a mil for windage. "If they come, Silas. If it's Volkov, he's not going to walk into the open. He's going to stay in the shadows. He doesn't know we're here," Silas said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "He thinks he's hunting a base of lambs. He doesn't know the old wolf and the ghost are watching the gate." Sierra didn't respond. She was looking through the scope again, her breathing slowing, her world narrowing to the small, magnified circle of the reticle. She felt the ghost settling back into her skin, an icy, detached presence that didn't feel pain, didn't feel guilt, and didn't feel love. "Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yeah? If I don't make it back down this ridge, if I lose myself again." Silas turned his head, his gray eyes shadowed by the hood of his parka. "You aren't going to lose yourself. Kid, you're going to find yourself. This is what you were made for. The tragedy isn't that you're here. The tragedy is that they tried to make you believe you belonged anywhere else. He reached out and tapped the chassis of the rifle. The rifle doesn't have a soul. Sierra, it just reflects yours. Now, let's get the thermals up. I want to see every heat signature on that ridge before the light hits the valley. They sat in the freezing darkness. 2 generations of killers bound by a shared burden. Below them, the lights of FOB Sentinel flickered. Unaware that the air was pregnant with the promise of lead, Sierra Vance gripped the MK13, her finger resting just outside the trigger guard, waiting for the world to break. The thrum was gone. In its place was a terrifying, perfect silence. The blue hour arrived with a deceptive, haunting beauty. It was that fragile window between deep night and true dawn where the snow-covered peaks of Montana turned to ghostly, luminescent indigo. For Sierra Vance, the light was a curse. In the shadows, she was invisible. In the blue, she was a silhouette. She lay prone in the frozen dirt, the MK13 Mod 7 tucked tight into her shoulder pocket. The cold of the Accuracy International chassis had long since migrated through her tactical layers, settling into her bones. Her fingers, encased in thin, high-dexterity shooting gloves, felt stiff, like wooden pegs. She began to flex them one by one, a rhythmic, mechanical ritual to keep the circulation flowing. Beside her, Silas was a statue. His eye was glued to the Leupold Mark IV spotting scope, his hands steady as stone on the tripod. Sun's coming up over the eastern shoulder. Silas whispered, light's going to wash out the valley floor first. The north ridge is going to stay in the dark for another 10 minutes. That's our window. Sierra, if they're up there, they'll be moving now to catch the transition. Sierra adjusted her cheek weld on the riser. The Night Force ATAC R was a marvel of glass. But even the best optics struggled with the mirage caused by the temperature difference between the freezing air and the warming earth. Silas, give me a fresh read on the Kestrel, Sierra said, her voice dropping into the low, emotionless register of the hunt. Density altitude is up to 4,950. Silas muttered, reading the digital display. Temperature is holding at 19 degrees. Humidity dropped to 70% as the wind shifted. Wind is coming from our 9 o'clock now, full value. Call it 12 miles per hour. Gusting to 15. Sierra's mind became a high-speed processor. 12 mph at 9 o'clock meant the wind was pushing the bullet directly to the right. At 750 yards. That was a massive shift. 12 mph. That's nearly 3.5 MOA of windage. Sierra calculated aloud. If I dial for 12 and it gusts to 15, I'm missing the head and hitting air. If I hold center, the bullet lands in the next county. Don't dial the wind, Silas advised, his voice a gravelly rasp. Dial for the elevation, get your drop set. Hold for the wind on the reticle. You need to be able to react to the gust in real time. Sierra reached up to the top turret of the Night Force. Click, 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 click. She dialed 14.75 MOA up. That was for the drop. She was now zeroed for 750 yards. If she pulled the trigger and there was no wind, the bullet would hit exactly where the crosshairs rested. But there was always wind. I'm dialed, she said, holding 4 MOA left on the MIL-R reticle. I'm aiming at nothing so I can hit something. Movement, Silas snapped. North Ridge, Sector 4, near that cluster of dead hemlocks. High elevation, near the rim. Sierra shifted the rifle with a practiced, agonizingly slow movement. She didn't use her muscles, she moved her entire body from the hips, keeping her skeletal alignment perfect. She scanned the hemlocks. There. A flash of movement that wasn't the wind. It was too linear, too purposeful. Through the 25x magnification, the north ridge became a jagged wall of detail. She saw a patch of white that was a shade too bright to be natural snow. I see him, Sierra said, her heart rate beginning to climb. She forced it down. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. Wait. He's in an alpine ghillie. Professional. He's setting up a tripod. Silas. That's a spotter. If there's a spotter, there's a shooter. I see the shooter now. Silas confirmed. 10 feet to the left of the spotter. Tucked under a rock overhang. He's got a long-barreled platform. Looks like a CheyTac M200 Intervention. God help us. Sierra. If he's got a .408 CheyTac, He can reach out and touch the base from twice our distance. He's ranging the command trailer. He's ranging Grant. The mention of her husband's name was like a jolt of electricity. The ghost wanted to scream, but the sniper stayed silent. They're prepping the opening shot. Sierra whispered. They take out the commanding officer. The base goes into a panic, and the ground teams move in through the gaps in the sensors. You have to take the shooter first, Silas said. Range is 742 yards. Angle is -8 degrees. You've got the high angle factor. Sierra, the bullet is going to fly flat because gravity is working with the arc. Aim low, base of the neck. Sierra settled the reticle on the man under the rock overhang. She could only see the top of his head and the long, sinister barrel of the CheyTac. He was a professional. He was calm. He was about to kill the man she loved. Silas, this is a cold bore shot, she said. A cold bore shot was the most difficult in the world. The first bullet through a cold barrel flies differently than the ones that follow. The steel hasn't expanded yet. The oil in the rifling hasn't burned off. There is no room for error. There is no sighter shot. Trust the math, Ghost, Silas said. Trust the rifle. You've been doing this in your sleep for a decade. The 5 years in between? That was just a nap. Wake up. Sierra's finger moved inside the trigger guard. She felt the cold steel of the trigger blade against the pad of her index finger. It was a 2-stage trigger. She pulled through the first pound of pressure. Click. The wall. Now, only a hair's breadth of pressure stood between life and death. The wind gusted. She saw the branches of the hemlocks whip to the right. Wind is up, Silas called. 15 mph. Hold 5 MOA left. Hold 5. Sierra shifted her aim point. She was no longer looking at the man. She was looking at a patch of empty gray rock 5 feet to his left. She was trusting the wind to carry her bullet into his skull. The world narrowed. The sound of her own blood rushing in her ears became a rhythmic thrum. The blue light of the morning felt like a spotlight. Grant, Danny, the vulture. Exhale. Pause. Squeeze. The MK13 roared. A violent, metallic bark that shattered the silence of the ridge. The recoil slammed into Sierra's shoulder. But she didn't flinch. She kept her eye behind the glass, following through the shot. The .300 Winchester Magnum round exited the muzzle at 2,850 feet per second. It crossed the 742-yard chasm in less than a second. Through the scope, Sierra saw a tiny puff of pink mist erupt against the gray rock overhang. The man with the CheyTac vanished. He didn't fall, he was simply deleted from the frame. Splash! Silas shouted, his voice cracking with a rare burst of emotion. Center mass. Shooter is down. The spotter is bailing. He's running for the trees. I'm on him, Sierra said, her voice a cold, terrifying monotone. She worked the bolt. Zip click. The spent brass casing ejected, spinning into the snow, smoking in the freezing air. A fresh round slid into the chamber. The spotter was fast. He was zigzagging through the rocks, heading for the dense timber. He was a moving target. Range is increasing, Silas called, his fingers dancing on the spotting scope. 780, 800. He's at 820. Wind is steady at 12. Lead him by 2 body widths. Sierra, lead him. Sierra didn't think. She didn't calculate. She just felt. This was the blood memory. Her brain knew the lead time. Her body knew the arc. She tracked the running man, the reticle floating ahead of him like a predator's eye. Squeeze. The second shot echoed across the valley. The spotter didn't even have time to scream. The heavy .300 Magnum round caught him in the mid-back. The kinetic energy flipping him forward like a rag doll. He hit the snow and slid 10 feet before coming to a dead stop. Silence returned to the ridge. But it was a different silence now. It was the silence of a grave. Sierra stayed behind the rifle, her breath coming in slow, controlled plumes. Her shoulder throbbed. Her cheek was numb. But for the first time in 5 years, the hollow feeling in her chest was gone. It had been replaced by cold, hard iron. 2 down, Silas whispered, his gray eyes looking at her with something akin to awe. My God, Sierra, you didn't even hesitate. Sierra pulled back from the rifle. She looked at her hands. They weren't trembling. They were as steady as the mountain itself. "I broke my promise, Silas," she said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. "I told Grant I was done. I told him I'd never be the ghost again." "You didn't break a promise," Silas said, reaching out to put a heavy hand on her shoulder. "You fulfilled a duty. Those two up there? They weren't men. They were the tip of a spear aimed at your husband's heart. You just broke the tip." A dull thud echoed from the valley floor. Then another. Thump, thump, thump. Sierra's head snapped toward the base. "Mortar tubes. They're launching from the north tree line." The first mortar round hit the motor pool at FOB Sentinel. The explosion was a bright, angry orange against the blue snow. Then came the siren, the inbound alarm, wavering and pathetic against the roar of the assault. "The ground teams are moving," Silas said, his voice urgent. "Look at the perimeter fence. Sector 2, they're cutting the wire." Sierra got back behind the glass. She saw them, a dozen men in dark tactical gear, moving with the terrifying precision of professional mercenaries. At their center, carrying a short-barreled carbine and wearing a black beret, was a man who moved with a limp Sierra would recognize anywhere. Viktor Volkov, the Vulture. He was here. He was walking through the smoke of the mortar hits, directing his men toward the command trailer. Toward Grant. "He's here, Silas," Sierra said, her voice turning into a serrated edge of ice. "Volkov is on the ground." "Can you take him?" Silas asked. "Range is 600 yards to the gate." Sierra looked through the night force. She saw Volkov's face. He looked older, more scarred, but the eyes were the same, the eyes of a man who enjoyed the no fire orders of his enemies. She centered the crosshairs on his chest. 15 MOA up, 4 MOA left. "Grant is in there," she thought. "Danny is in the ground. And the Vulture is in my sights. I don't have a clear shot." Sierra hissed. "He's using the burning Humvee as cover. He's smart. He knows there's a shooter on the ridge now." Volkov looked up. It was impossible. But for a second, Sierra felt like he was looking directly through her lens. Directly into her soul. He raised his carbine and fired a burst toward the south ridge. The rounds hitting the rocks 20 feet below their position. He knew. "The game is up," Silas said, grabbing his rifle. "They're going to pivot their fire to us. We need to move to the secondary position. Sierra, now." "No," Sierra said, her finger tightening on the trigger as Volkov moved into a gap in the smoke. "I'm not moving until he's dead." "Sierra, that's a suicide play. They'll bracket us with mortars in 3 minutes." "Then we have 3 minutes." Sierra said. "Silas, give me a lead for a moving target at 600. He's heading for the trailer. If he reaches that door, Grant is gone." The blue hour was over. The sun broke over the ridge, turning the snow into a blinding, brilliant white. The war for FOB Sentinel had begun, and the ghost was no longer hiding in the shadows. She was the one holding the light. The valley was no longer a silent wilderness. It was a throat-ripping scream of metal and high explosives. At FOB Sentinel, the gathering storm had finally broken, and it was raining fire. Below the south ridge, the motor pool was a funeral pyre of rubber and diesel. Black oily smoke rolled across the compound, clashing with the pristine white snow. Sierra watched through her Night Force ATAC R. Her world reduced to a 10-inch circle of magnified chaos. She saw her husband, Grant, burst out of the command trailer, his M4 carbine up, screaming orders that were swallowed by the roar of a second mortar strike. "They're bracketing us, Sierra," Silas yelled over the thunder. He wasn't looking through his spotting scope anymore. He was looking at the north ridge with his naked eye. "That wasn't a random hit. They saw your muzzle flash. The next tube is zeroing our coordinates." "I need 30 seconds, Sierra hissed. Her reticle was dancing through the smoke, hunting for the black beret. "We don't have 30 seconds. If that third round is a fire for effect, this ledge becomes a crater." Silas grabbed the shoulder of her parka, trying to pull her back. "Move, ghost. That's an order from a superior officer. You're retired, Silas, and I'm a civilian." Sierra didn't budge. Her skeletal lock was perfect. Her body a heavy, immobile anchor for the MK13. Through the glass, she saw Volkov. The Vulture was moving with a predatory elegance, staying in the dead space created by the burning wreckage of a Humvee. He was 580 yards away, an easy shot in a vacuum. A nightmare in a combat zone filled with heat haze and swirling debris. Wind is shifting, Silas barked, his survival instinct overriding his frustration. He fell back into the spotting scope. It's swirling in the bowl. Call it 10 miles per hour. Coming from our 6 now. It's pushing the round down and left. Hold 2 mil dots high. 1 mil dot right. Sierra adjusted. In her mind, the ballistics were a living thing. The 220-grain Sierra Matchking would have to punch through the thermal layers created by the fires. The air was dirty. Click. She felt the trigger reset. Volkov paused. He was barked an order into a handheld radio. His profile momentarily exposed against the snow. Exhale. Heartbeat. Squeeze. The MK13 kicked. But in the millisecond before the firing pin struck, a mortar round impacted the slope 40 yards below their position. The ledge shuddered. The shockwave tossed Sierra's aim off by a fraction of a millimeter. Miss, Silas screamed. High and right. You hit the Humvee's chassis. Volkov didn't panic. He dove into the smoke, disappearing like his namesake into a cloud. But he knew. He looked toward the south ridge and threw a jagged hand signal to his heavy weapons team on the north ridge. Incoming. Silas lunged for Sierra, tackling her off the rifle just as a 60mm mortar round screeched through the air. The explosion hit the rear of their rocky shelf. Granite shattered like glass. Shrapnel hissed through the air, shredding the stunted pines above them. Sierra felt the world flip. White snow, gray rock, black sky. Her ears were ringing with a high-pitched, agonizing whine. Sierra, talk to me. Silas was shaking her. His face was streaked with soot, a jagged cut over his eye leaking dark blood. She coughed, tasting cordite and dirt. She scrambled back toward the MK13. The rifle was buried under a layer of pulverized rock, but the heavy tan chassis looked intact. She wiped the glass of the objective lens with her sleeve. I'm okay, she gasped, her voice sounding like it was underwater. The rifle? Forget the rifle. They've got our range. Kid, we have to displace to the secondary hide. Sierra looked down at the base. The mercenaries had breached the north gate. They were moving in a V formation, laying down suppressive fire that had Grant's men pinned behind the concrete barriers of the mess hall. Volkov was leading the charge, heading straight for the command trailer, Grant's last stand. If we move, they die, Sierra said. She grabbed the MK13, shaking the debris off the bolt. I'm staying. Silas, get the M110. We need volume, not just precision. Silas looked at her, seeing the ghost in full bloom. There was no fear in her, only a cold, terrifying clarity. He reached into the gear bag and pulled out the M110 semi-automatic sniper system. Fine, he growled, slamming a 20-round magazine into the mag well. I'll suppress the gate. You hunt the vulture. On the valley floor, Grant Vance was living through a nightmare. Get that saw running, he yelled at a young specialist who was fumbling with a jammed M249. Hayes, left flank, don't let them circle the trailer. The air was filled with the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of AK pattern rifles and the sharper, more disciplined cracks of his own men's M4s. But over the cacophony, Grant heard something else. Boom. It wasn't a mortar. It wasn't an M4. It was the heavy, authoritative bark of a long-action bolt rifle. 8.300 Win Mag. He knew that sound. He'd heard it 1,000 times at the range during Sierra's wildlife shoots. He'd always wondered why she preferred such a heavy, punishing caliber for photography gear. He looked up at the south ridge. Through the smoke and the falling snow, he saw the twin muzzle flashes. Sierra? The thought was absurd. Impossible. Captain, movement at the gate, Hayes screamed. A team of 4 mercenaries was sprinting across the open ground, carrying a shaped charge meant for the trailer door. Grant raised his carbine, but he was out of angle. Then, the world seemed to slow down. The lead mercenary's head snapped back as if he'd been hit by an invisible sledgehammer. He went down in a heap of tangled limbs. 2 seconds later, the man behind him collapsed, a massive exit wound blooming in his chest. Zip pop, zip pop. The heavy rounds were falling from the sky like the wrath of God. It wasn't just shooting, it was surgery performed at 2,800 feet per second. Grant watched, mesmerized and horrified. He recognized the rhythm, the 2-second cycle. Shoot, bolt, breathe, shoot. It was the signature of a Tier 1 scout sniper. Someone's got our back, Hayes cheered, unleashing a burst of fire. Look at the ridge, it's an angel with a heavy barrel. Grant didn't cheer. His stomach dropped. He knew exactly who was on that ridge. He knew why she'd been so quiet lately. He knew why she looked at him with such desperate love every morning. Sierra, he whispered, his heart breaking even as she saved his life. Up on the ledge, Sierra was a machine. Wind is gusting to 20. Silas shouted, his M110 barking in a rapid, rhythmic cadence as he picked off the mercenaries at the fence line. Hold 6 MOA right, 6 MOA. Sierra didn't dial. She didn't have time. She was using the Tremor 3 reticle, a complex grid of dots and lines that allowed her to hold for wind and elevation simultaneously without touching the turrets. She found Volkov again. He was behind the fuel depot, preparing to toss a thermite grenade into the diesel tanks. If those tanks went, the entire north side of the base would be erased. I see the Vulture, Sierra said. Her voice was a flat, dead thing. He's at the tanks. Silas, I need a dead on hold. You've got a crosswind gusting between the buildings, Silas warned. It's a canyon effect. The wind is hitting the mess hall and doubling back. It's a literal coin flip. Sierra. She didn't listen to the odds. She listened to the rifle. She felt the vibration of the base's sirens in the stock. Volkov stepped out to throw. Sierra didn't aim at his head. She aimed at the grenade in his hand. Squeeze. The MK13 kicked. At 600 yards, the bullet didn't hit Volkov. It hit the thermite canister just as his fingers released it. The high-velocity impact detonated the magnesium charge instantly. A blinding white flash consumed the fuel depot. Sierra saw Volkov thrown backward by the blast, his silhouette engulfed in a fountain of sparks. He went over a concrete barrier, disappearing into a secondary explosion as a nearby fuel line ignited. Target neutralized, Silas yelled, but there was no joy in it. But we've got a problem. Ghost, look up. Sierra pulled her eye away from the scope. The north ridge was glowing, not from the sun, but from the muzzle flashes of a dozen RPG launchers. They weren't aiming at the base anymore. They're leveling the south ridge, Silas said, dropping his rifle and reaching for her. Jump, Sierra, jump. The world turned into a roar of white light as the first RPG hit the ledge. Gravity is a cruel mistress, but inertia is a killer. When the RPG slammed into the granite face of the south ridge, the world didn't just explode, it disintegrated. The shelf, the crow's nest, Sierra and Silas had called home for the last few hours, simply ceased to exist. Sierra felt the shockwave first. It wasn't a sound, it was a physical punch to the solar plexus that emptied her lungs. Then came the roar, a jagged, ear-splitting tectonic scream as thousands of pounds of shale and snow gave way. She felt herself falling, a sickening lurch of weightlessness, before her world turned into a chaotic washing machine of ice, rock, and fire. She came to rest 40 feet down the slope, buried waist-deep in a drift of pulverized granite and fresh powder. Her lungs were screaming for air that was thick with the scent of ozone and cordite. She coughed, a ragged, wet sound, and tasted copper. Silas, she croaked. Her voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. No answer, only the distant, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the base's heavy machine guns and the crackle of the burning fuel depot below. She clawed at the snow, her fingers numb, searching for the one thing that mattered. Her hand hit cold steel. The MK13 Mod 7. She pulled it from the drift like an Excalibur made of tan Cerakote. The Night Force scope was scarred, the sunshade bent, but the glass looked intact. Zero shift, she thought, the professional sniper overriding the concussed woman. If the chassis took a hit, the point of aim could be off by inches. At 600 yards, inches are miles. Ghost. The voice was weak, coming from behind a jagged slab of rock 10 feet above her. Sierra scrambled up, her knees screaming in protest. She found Silas pinned under a fallen pine tree, His leg was bent at an angle that made her stomach flip. And his face was a mask of crimson. Silas, stay with me, Colonel. She grabbed a fallen branch, using it as a lever to heave the trunk off his shattered limb. Silas let out a hiss of air through gritted teeth. The rifle. Did you save the rifle? I've got it, but we're exposed. Silas, they're bracketing the slope. We have to move. Can't move. Silas gasped, clutching his thigh. Femur's gone. I'm an anchor now. Kid, you have to go down. Get to Grant. Sierra looked down at FOB Sentinel. The smoke was clearing slightly. The mercenaries had breached the second perimeter. Volkov, the Vulture, had survived the thermite blast. She saw him through the haze. His tactical gear charred, half his face a ruin of raw, red skin. He was limping, but he was moving with a manic, murderous energy. He wasn't heading for the command trailer anymore. He was looking up. He was looking for her. He's coming for us, Sierra whispered. He's not interested in the base. He wants the ghost's head. Down in the compound, Grant Vance was a man possessed. He had seen the RPG hit the south ridge. He had seen the shelf collapse. Major, I need a fire team for the south ridge. Grant shouted into his radio, his voice cracking with a desperation he couldn't hide. We've got friendly snipers down. Negative, Captain. Major Holloway's voice crackled back through the static. The north gate is failing. We can't spare a single man. If we lose the mess hall, we lose the base. Hold your position. Grant ignored him. He looked at Hayes, the young specialist who was reloading his saw. Hayes, cover the command trailer. I'm going for the ridge. Sir? The major said. I don't give a damn what the major said. That's my wife up there. The words hung in the freezing air like a physical weight. Hayes froze, his eyes wide. The soldiers nearby stopped firing for a split second, the reality of the statement hitting them harder than any mortar round. The photographer, the quiet woman who took pictures of birds. She was the one who had been raining death from the sky. Go, Captain, Hayes said, his voice turning hard. We'll hold the line. Go get her. Grant didn't wait. He sprinted into the smoke, heading for the fuel depot trail. Every instinct he had as an officer was screaming at him that he was abandoning his post. But every fiber of his being as a man knew he couldn't live in a world where Sierra was a ghost he couldn't catch. Up on the slope, Sierra had dragged Silas into a shallow rock crevice. She had tied a tourniquet around his leg using her camera strap. Her hands steady despite the adrenaline. You got to check the zero. Silas wheezed, handing her a single round of .300 Win mag he'd kept in his pocket. Take a shot at that rusted oil drum by the motor pool. 500 yards. See where it lands. It'll give away our new position. Sierra argued. They already know where we are. Sierra, if that rifle is off, you're just throwing expensive rocks. Check the zero. Sierra settled behind the MK13. She felt the wobble in her transition. Her concussion was making the reticle dance. She breathed, deep and slow, forcing the world to stabilize. She found the rusted drum. 500 yards. No wind in the crevice, but a 10 miles per hour crosswind on the slope. Squeeze. The rifle barked. She watched the impact. The bullet hit the snow 3 inches high and 2 inches left of her aim point. Zero shift, she muttered. 3 inches high, 2 left. At 500. Dial it out, Silas commanded. 6 clicks down, 4 clicks right. Do it now. Sierra adjusted the turrets. Click, 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 click. The mechanical sound felt like a clock ticking down to her own execution. Movement caught her eye. Below them, a team of 4 mercenaries was starting the climb. They were moving fast, using the boulders for cover. And at their lead was Volkov. He wasn't hiding. He was holding a Steyr SSG-69. His eye already looking for a silhouette. They're 300 yards out. Sierra said, Silas, I'm out of time. Then stop being Sierra Vance. Silas said, his voice turning into the same gravelly roar that had commanded men in the jungles of Nam. Stop being the wife. Stop being the photographer. Be the ghost. Be the thing they fear in the dark. Put the lead where it belongs. Sierra looked through the scope. She saw Volkov stop. He raised his rifle. In that heartbeat, the world became a math problem. Distance, 280 yards. Angle, 30 degrees down. Windage, Negligible at this range. Hold low. Lead nothing. I see you, Viktor, Sierra whispered. But as her finger took up the slack, a different shape entered her field of view. A man in an American OCP uniform, sprinting up the trail from the fuel depot. M4 raised. Grant? Sierra's heart stopped. He was running straight into Volkov's kill zone. He didn't see the mercenaries in the rocks. He only saw the ridge where he thought his wife was dying. Grant, stop, she screamed, though he couldn't hear her. Volkov saw him too. The vulture smiled, a horrific, charred grin. He shifted his aim from the ridge to the man on the trail. He wasn't going to kill the ghost yet. He was going to make her watch her world end first. Sierra's world narrowed to the center of Volkov's scope. Not this time, she hissed. Not again. The world narrowed to a shaky, 10-inch circle of glass. Inside that circle, the laws of physics were the only thing that mattered. Outside of it, Sierra's heart was shattering. Grant was 200 yards below her, sprinting up the shale-covered trail. His breathing probably as ragged as hers. He was exposed, a silhouette against the pristine white snow. And 60 yards to his left, tucked behind a jagged overhang of black basalt, Viktor Volkov was settling into his Steyr SSG-69. Sierra could see the vulture's finger tightening on his trigger. He wasn't aiming for a quick kill. He was aiming for Grant's gut. He wanted a screamer, a wounded man to draw the ghost out of her hole. Sierra, take the shot, Silas wheezed behind her, his hand gripping her ankle so hard she could feel his tremors. Forget the wind, forget the concussion, just kill that son of a bitch. I've got a zero shift. Silas, she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. I'm holding low left. I had to guesstimate the high-angle compensation. High-angle shooting, one of the most counterintuitive parts of ballistics. Whether you're shooting up or down a steep grade, gravity only acts on the horizontal distance. To the bullet, Grant and Volkov weren't 280 yards away, they were effectively closer. If she aimed dead on, her round would sail right over Volkov's head. Aim at his belt buckle. Silas growled, let the arc do the work. Sierra shifted the MK13. The Night Force reticle blurred for a second, a symptom of the head injury, and she blinked hard, forcing her vision to snap back into focus. She centered the crosshairs on Volkov's midsection. The vulture's head was down, cheek pressed to his stock. He was steady, he was professional. Sierra felt the wall of the trigger. 1.5 pounds of pressure already gone. Only a half pound remained. Inhale, exhale. Stop. The MK13 roared. The recoil was a familiar, violent shove against her bruised shoulder. In the scope, she watched the .300 Win mag tracer, a faint, blurred streak of kinetic energy, arc through the freezing air. It didn't hit his belt buckle. Because of her corrected zero and the steep 30-degree decline, the heavy 220-grain Machking round struck Volkov exactly where his neck met his shoulder. The impact was catastrophic. The vulture didn't just drop, he was physically launched backward, his stare flying from his hands as he tumbled over the basalt ledge. Splash! Silas barked. He's down. Volkov is down. Grant froze on the trail. He looked at the ledge where Volkov had just been erased, then slowly turned his head upward. He looked directly at the rock crevice where Sierra was perched. The smoke from her muzzle was still lingering in the cold air. A thin, gray finger pointing right at her. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Grant stood there, his M4 lowered, staring at the photographer he had married. He saw the ghillie-draped barrel of the sniper rifle. He saw the cold, professional posture of a killer. He saw the ghost. Grant, move, Sierra screamed, her voice finally breaking the silence of the mountain. The others, 6 o'clock, move. The 3 remaining mercenaries, seeing their leader fall, didn't retreat. They were professionals, contractors paid to finish the job. They pivoted, opening fire on Grant with suppressed AK-12s. Get down, Sierra yelled. Grant dove behind a boulder just as a stream of 5.45 mm rounds chewed into the frozen earth where he'd been standing. Sierra worked the bolt. Zip-click. The spent brass hissed as it hit the snow. Range is 240, she called out to Silas. But Silas was fading. his eyes rolling back from the pain of his shattered leg. I'm on him, Silas mumbled, trying to reach for his spotting scope. Sierra didn't wait. She didn't need a spotter anymore. This was close quarters for a sniper. Snap shooting gallery. She tracked the first mercenary, a big man in a white parka. He was trying to flank Grant's boulder. She didn't dial the scope. She used the Christmas tree grid on the Tremor 3 reticle. Hold 2 dots low, 1 dot right for the swirling canyon breeze. Squeeze. The MK13 barked again. The man in the white parka folded mid-stride, the round punching through his soft armor like it was made of cardboard. 2 left. They were smart. They realized they couldn't hit Grant while she had the high ground. So they turned their attention back to the ridge. One of them pulled a thermobaric grenade from his vest. Sierra, grenade, Silas screamed, finding a sudden burst of lucidity. Sierra saw the mercenary's arm go back. She didn't aim for the man. She aimed for the gap between his fingers. Squeeze. The shot hit the man's forearm, shattering the bone and sending the grenade tumbling into the snow at his own feet. 3 seconds later, a muffled crump shook the slope. A cloud of white phosphorus and heat erupted, consuming the third mercenary in a terrifying, blinding flash. The last man, the youngest of the group, looked at the carnage. Looked at the ridge, and did the only thing a sane human could do. He turned and ran, disappearing into the thick timber of the north ridge. Sierra stayed behind the rifle, her eye glued to the glass, her finger hovering over the trigger. Her breathing was a jagged, sobbing mess. Is he safe? She gasped. He's moving, Silas whispered, looking through his binos. Grant's coming up. Sierra, he's coming for you. Sierra pulled back from the rifle. She slumped against the cold stone, the MK13 falling into her lap. The adrenaline was draining out of her, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell. 5 minutes later, the crunch of boots on shale reached her ears. A shadow fell over the crevice. Grant Vance stood at the entrance, his uniform torn, his face splattered with mud and soot. He looked at Silas, then he looked at the rifle. Finally, he looked at Sierra. He didn't move, he didn't offer a hand. He just stared at her with a look of profound, soul-deep confusion. Sierra? He said. His voice was small, stripped of his captain's authority. Sierra looked up at him, her green eyes filled with tears she couldn't stop. She looked at her hands, the hands that had just taken 4 lives in less than 60 seconds. I told you I was a photographer. Grant, she whispered, her voice cracking. I just never told you that I only take pictures of things I've already killed in my head. Below them, the sirens of FOB Sentinel finally died down. The sky was a pale, mocking blue. The ghost was no longer a secret, and the marriage was no longer a sanctuary. The sky had fallen, and they were all buried in the wreckage. The silence that followed the carnage was heavier than the snow. It was a suffocating, static-filled void where the only sound was the jagged rasp of Sierra's breath and the frantic ping-ping-ping of cooling metal from the burning wreckage below. Grant didn't move. He stood at the edge of the crevice, his M4 slung low, his eyes fixed on the MK13 Mod 7 cradled in Sierra's lap. He looked like a man who had walked into his own living room and found a mountain lion sitting in his chair. Sierra, he said again, his voice cracking, tell me I'm concussed. Tell me I'm seeing things. Sierra didn't look up. She was staring at her hands, blackened with carbon, stained with Silas's blood, and steady as the North Star. You aren't seeing things, Grant. You're just finally seeing me. She forced herself to stand, her joints popping like small caliber fire. She ignored the vertigo and the throbbing in her skull. She moved past him to the edge of the ledge, raising her binoculars, the Vortex Fury rangefinders, to her eyes. What are you doing? Grant asked, his tone shifting from shock to the sharp, defensive edge of a commanding officer. The medics are on the way. Holloway is sending a QRF to the ridge. It's over. It's not over, Sierra said, her voice a flat, dead line. I hit Volkov at 280 yards. High angle. I saw the impact, neck and shoulder. I saw it too, Grant said. He went over the ledge. No one survives a .300 Win mag to the throat. Sierra, he's gone. No, Sierra hissed. her eyes scanning the basalt outcrop where the vulture had fallen. "Look at the snow. Grant, look at the drag marks." Grant pulled his own optics. He followed her gaze to the black rocks. There was a spray of crimson, a vivid, violent red against the white, but the body was gone. A jagged, uneven trail of blood led away from the ledge, disappearing into the whiteout of the thickening storm. "He's a ghost, Grant," Sierra said. "Men like Volkov don't die from good shots. You have to erase them." The storm had reached a crescendo. The wind was a literal wall of white, reducing visibility to less than 30 yards. It was a sniper's nightmare and a predator's playground. In this whiteout, optics were useless. Thermal signatures were scrambled by the swirling ice. It came down to sound, smell, and the sixth sense that only hunters possess. "You aren't going after him," Grant said, grabbing her arm. "That's an order, Sierra." Sierra spun on him, her green eyes flashing with a ferocity that made him take a half step back. "You aren't my captain, Grant. You're the man who almost died because I obeyed an order 5 years ago. I'm not letting him leave this mountain. If he gets into that timber, he'll wait, he'll heal, and then he'll come for you in your sleep. Or he'll find the next base. The next Danny Reeves." She checked the magazine on the MK13. 3 rounds left. She reached into Silas's pocket and grabbed a handful of loose Win Mag cartridges, shoving them into her parka. "Grant, take Silas," she said, her voice softening just an inch. "He's got a shattered femur. He needs a tourniquet and a medevac. If you want to help, save the man who saved us." Grant looked at Silas, who was drifting in and out of consciousness. Then back at Sierra. He saw the phantom in her, the legendary Marine Scout sniper who had 94 confirmed kills before she was 25. He realized he didn't know this woman. He loved her. He had shared a bed with her for 3 years. But he had never met the soul that lived behind the rifle. "I'm coming with you," he said. "No, you're a grunt, Grant. You move like a freight train in this snow. You'll give me away before I even see him. Stay with Silas. That's the only way I can do this." Without waiting for his answer, she turned and vanished into the white. The hunt was a slow-motion dance in a freezer. Sierra moved in a low crawl, her rifle pushed ahead of her. She wasn't using the scope anymore, she had flipped the caps down. She was relying on the blood memory. She followed the blood trail, dark, frozen rubies in the powder. Volkov was losing a lot of blood, but he was moving with terrifying purpose. He wasn't retreating toward the north ridge, he was circling back. He was hunting her. She stopped behind a fallen log, her ears straining. 15 miles per hour wind, the shush 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 of snow hitting Gore-Tex. Then, a metallic clink. 20 yards to her left. Sierra didn't turn her head. She shifted her eyes. Through the shifting veil of the storm, she saw a shape, a silhouette draped in a scorched alpine ghillie suit. Volkov was leaning against a pine tree, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, his jaw a mangled ruin, but his right hand was steady. He was holding a sidearm, a Glock 17 with a suppressor. He was waiting for the wind to drop so he could hear her breathe. Sierra felt the cold seep into her lungs. She was in the dead space, the area where a sniper's long-range advantage is neutralized by proximity. At 20 yards, the MK13 was an oversized club. She reached for her own sidearm, a suppressed Sig Sauer M18, but stopped. The Vulture didn't deserve a handgun. He deserved the ghost. She slowly began to rotate the MK13. Every millimeter was a risk. The snow on her sleeves crunched like breaking glass. Volkov turned his head. He didn't see her, but he felt her. He raised the Glock, scanning the white void. "I know you're there, ghost," Volkov rasped, his voice a wet, gurgling mess. He spoke in English, the words twisted by his shattered jaw. "I felt your bullet. It was sub-MOA, beautiful, but you missed the spine." Sierra didn't speak. She didn't breathe. She was counting the gusts. 1, 2, 3. The wind died for a split second. The lull. Sierra lunged from behind the log, bringing the MK13 to her shoulder in a single, violent motion. Volkov fired, 3 suppressed pops. The rounds hissed past Sierra's ear, one of them grazing her shoulder, tearing the Gore-Tex. Sierra didn't flinch. She didn't need a scope at this range. She looked down the side of the barrel, using the point shooting technique she'd mastered in the ruins of Fallujah. Squeeze. The .300 Win Mag round, designed to kill at 1,000 yards, hit Volkov at 60 feet. The kinetic energy was absolute. It didn't just stop him, it tore through his chest and pinned him to the pine tree behind him. The Vulture slumped, his Glock falling into the snow. He looked down at the massive hole in his chest, then up at Sierra as she approached. She stood over him, the MK13 pointed at his forehead. Her face was a mask of ice, her green eyes devoid of anything resembling mercy. "For Danny Reeves," she whispered. "Wait," Volkov gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. You follow orders." "Not today," Sierra said. She didn't pull the trigger. She watched him. She watched the light fade from his eyes. She watched the Vulture turn into a piece of meat in the Montana snow. She wanted him to feel the cold. She wanted him to know that in the end, the "no fire" order had been revoked. When his head finally slumped forward, Sierra didn't feel a sense of triumph. She felt empty. The scale of balance she'd been trying to fix for 5 years was still tilted. 17 dead Marines in Kabul. 2 dead soldiers at Sentinel. 13 dead mercenaries on the ridge. The math of war never added up to 0. Grant found her 10 minutes later. He was carrying Silas over his shoulders, staggering through the drifts. He saw the body pinned to the tree. He saw Sierra standing there, a lonely, gray figure in the whiteout. He set Silas down gently and walked toward her. He didn't care about the rifle anymore. He didn't care about the secret. "Sierra," he said, his voice raw, "it's over. The QRF is here. The North Ridge is clear." Sierra turned to him. The ghost was receding, leaving behind a woman who was shivering, bleeding, and utterly broken. She looked at the blood on her jacket. "I can't go back, Grant," she said, her voice a fragile thread. "I can't go back to taking pictures of birds. I can't pretend I don't see the world in minutes of angle." Grant reached out and took her face in his hands. His palms were warm, the only warm thing in the world. "Then don't go back," he said. "We'll find a new way. But you're coming home. That's the only order I'm ever going to give you." Sierra leaned her forehead against his chest and finally, for the first time since the first mortar hit, she let herself cry. The tears were hot, stinging, and honest. Above them, the storm began to break. A sliver of sunlight pierced the gray clouds, illuminating the south ridge. The shadow of the Sentinel was gone. In its place was a woman who had been a ghost, and a man who had finally learned that the most dangerous thing in the wilderness isn't the wolf. It's the person who protects the pack. The sound of a battlefield dying is a peculiar thing. It's replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the cavalry arriving. 2 MHz -60 Black Hawks crested the North Ridge, their rotors beating the frigid air into a frantic pulse. The thump 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 echoed off the granite walls, a sound that usually meant salvation. For Sierra Vance, sitting on a blood-stained crate in the remains of the motor pool, it sounded like an indictment. A Navy corpsman was wrapping a pressure bandage around her shoulder where Volkov's round had grazed her. He was young, maybe 20, and his hands were shaking. He kept stealing glances at the tan MK13 Mod 7 leaning against the crate next to her. To him, it was a relic from a video game. To the woman sitting there, it was the heavy anchor that had pulled her back into the abyss. "You're good to go, ma'am," the corpsman stammered, his eyes wide. Just an inch deeper and we'd be talking about a prosthetic." Sierra didn't thank him. She didn't even look at him. She was watching the dust-off team load Silas cross into the lead helicopter. The old colonel was pale, a nasal cannula pumping oxygen into his lungs. But as they lifted his litter, he turned his head. His gray eyes found hers. He didn't salute. He just nodded once, a silent, grim acknowledgement between two predators who had held the line. Sierra. Grant was standing 10 feet away. He had changed into a fresh parka, but his face was still streaked with the carbon and grease of the fight. He looked at her, and for the first time in 3 years, there was a wall between them. It wasn't built of anger, it was built of a terrifying, newfound respect that felt a lot like distance. "The investigators are here," Grant said, his voice flat. Sid and a JAG officer from Regional Command. They're in the mess hall. They want a statement. I saved your base, Grant, Sierra said, her voice raspy. I know you did. And every man on this base knows it too. But you're a civilian who just executed 13 high-precision long-range engagements with a weapon that isn't on our manifest. In the eyes of the Pentagon, that's a legal minefield. Sierra stood up. The vertigo hit her, but she shoved it down. She grabbed the MK13 by the pistol grip. I'll give them my statement. The mess hall had been turned into a makeshift tactical operations center. A woman in a charcoal gray suit sat at a folding table. A ruggedized Panasonic toughbook open in front of her. Beside her stood a man in OCPs with the oak leaves of a major on his chest. Mrs. Vance, the woman said, not looking up from her screen. I'm Special Agent Julia Thorne. Sid, this is Major Sterling. Jag, please, take a seat. Sierra sat. She placed the MK13 on the table between them. The heavy thud of the rifle made the major flinch. Let's start with the weapon, Agent Thorne said, finally looking up. Her eyes were sharp, bureaucratic, and entirely unimpressed by the heroics of the morning. A Remington 700 based long-action. Accuracy International chassis. Suppressed. This is Tier 1 equipment. Mrs. Vance, how does a wildlife photographer come into possession of a suppressed sniper system? It belongs to Colonel Silas Cross. Sierra said, I was just the operator. The operator, Major Sterling repeated, leaning forward. Mrs. Vance, we've spent the last hour reviewing the sensor logs and the impact points. We found 2 bodies on the North Ridge, one at 742 yards. One at 820. Both headshots. Both taken during a high-altitude storm with 20-knot crosswinds. He tapped a folder on the table. There are maybe 20 people in the entire U.S. military capable of making those shots under those conditions. 10 of them are currently deployed. The other 9 are instructors at Fort Bragg or Pendleton. Agent Thorne turned her laptop around. On the screen was a scanned military record. It was heavily redacted, covered in black bars that hid dates and locations. But the name at the top was clear. Sergeant Sierra, Shadow, Vance. USMC. 0317 Scout Sniper. 94 confirmed kills. Thorne read, her voice devoid of emotion. Bronze Star with Valor. 3 Purple Hearts. Discharged 2021. Reason. Secret, high-level policy conflict. Grant, who was standing by the door, let out a breath that sounded like a groan. He had known she was a Marine. He had known she had seen combat. But Scout Sniper? 0317? That was a world of ghosts and monsters. You're the Phantom of Kabul, Major Sterling said, his voice losing its edge. Replaced by a strange, professional awe. The one who stayed in the clock tower during the North Gate massacre. The one who was ordered to stand down while the Vulture coordinated the mortar teams. Sierra's jaw tightened so hard her teeth ached. The blood memory flared up. The smell of Danny's blood. The heat of the dust. I did my job, Sierra said. You did, Thorne agreed. And today, you finished it. We found the man pinned to the tree. Viktor Volkov. Interpol has been hunting him for a decade. You neutralized the single greatest mercenary threat in the Northern Hemisphere with 3 rounds of .300 Win Mag. Thorne closed the laptop. Legally, you're in a gray zone. You're a civilian acting in self-defense and the defense of others. Given the status of the target and the fact that you saved a U.S. captain and 25 soldiers. The JAG office is declining to pursue charges. In fact, the Pentagon wants this buried. They don't want the world knowing a retired sniper is living in Montana taking pictures of elk. So I'm free to go? Sierra asked. You're free, Major Sterling said. He stood up and, to Sierra's shock, snapped a crisp, textbook perfect salute. But the community, the sniper community? They're already talking. You can't go back to being a photographer. Sergeant, not after this. The world knows the ghost is still haunting the mountains. Sierra walked out of the mess hall into the biting cold. The sun was setting, casting long, orange shadows across the North Ridge. The base was quiet now. The frantic energy replaced by the somber reality of the cleanup. She found Grant by the perimeter fence, looking out at the spot where Volkov had died. You didn't tell me, he said. He didn't turn around. 3 years. Sierra, you let me believe you were fragile. I never said I was fragile. Grant, I said I was tired. She stepped up beside him. If I had told you I was a scout sniper, you would have seen a weapon every time you looked at me. I wanted you to see a woman. Grant turned to her. His eyes were wet. I saw you on that trail today. I saw you erase a man from 800 yards away like you were swatting a fly. I didn't see a weapon. Sierra, I saw a guardian, but I also saw the cost. I saw what it does to you. He reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of carbon from her cheek. The Major is right. You can't stay here. The Vulture was just one man. But he had friends, contracts. Now that the word is out that the Phantom is active, Sentinel isn't a safe harbor anymore. It's a bullseye. I know, Sierra said. She felt the heavy business card in her pocket, the one Silas had given her months ago, with a direct line to the commandant of the sniper school at Fort Benning. What are you going to do? Grant asked. Sierra looked up at the north ridge. The snow was pristine again, covering the blood and the brass. She thought about the young kids on the base, the ones who didn't know how to read the wind. The ones who would have died if she hadn't been there. I spent 5 years trying to prove I wasn't a killer, she said. Maybe I should spend the next 5 years making sure the next generation doesn't have to be ghosts just to survive. I'm going to teach. Grant, I'm going to take the job. Grant nodded slowly. He didn't like it. He wanted his quiet life back, knowing he was a soldier. He understood that some debts are never fully paid. Then I guess we're moving to Georgia, he said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. Sierra leaned into him, the cold wind whipping around them. For the first time in 5 years, the Phantom wasn't a secret she had to carry. It was a mantle she had chosen to wear. Grant? Yeah? I still want to take pictures of the birds. Grant laughed, a dry, weary sound. As long as you aren't ranging them. Shadow. As long as you aren't ranging them. As the last light of the Montana sun dipped below the horizon, Sierra Vance turned her back on the ridge. She left the spent brass and the ghosts behind. She was no longer a secret. She was a legend, and in the world of long-range precision, legends never really die. They just wait for the wind to drop. The air in Georgia was a heavy, humid blanket, a stark contrast to the crystalline, bone-chilling dry of Montana. Here at Fort Moore, the place everyone still called Benning, the wind didn't scream through canyons. It whispered through the thick pine stands and over the red clay of the sniper ranges. Sierra Vance stood on the firing line of Range 74, her boots planted firmly in the Georgia dirt. She was dressed in a tan flight suit, the standard uniform of the instructors. But on her shoulder was a custom patch that Silas had sent her in the mail, a silhouette of a ghost holding a long rifle, with the words "They never see it coming" embroidered in black silk. In front of her stood 15 candidates. They were young, lean, and possessed the dangerous, quiet confidence of men who had been the best shots in their infantry platoons. They looked at the woman before them with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. To them, she was a contractor, a civilian. They didn't know about the 106 confirmed kills. They didn't know about the Phantom of Kabul. "Morning, gentlemen," Sierra said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that cut through the humid air like a suppressed round. "My name is Instructor Vance. I'm here to teach you that everything you think you know about shooting is wrong." A tall corporal in the front row smirked. "With all due respect, ma'am, I've got a 250-yard expert badge and a clean record on the M110. Sierra didn't smile. She didn't argue. She reached down and picked up an M2010 enhanced sniper rifle, .300 Win Mag, that was sitting on the bench. She didn't check the chamber. She knew it was hot. She didn't adjust the bipod. She turned, dropped into a seated position, the most unstable of the tactical stances, and looked at a steel plate at 800 yards. The wind was a fishtail, switching between 3 and 6 o'clock. "Ranging 800, she muttered, her eyes narrowing as she read the mirage rising off the red clay. "Dialing 18 MOA for drop. Holding 2 MOA left for the switch." Squeeze. The M2010 roared. A split second later, a distant clink echoed back. Center mass. She worked the bolt, zip-click, and fired again before the echo had even died. Clink. She did it 3 more times. 5 shots. 5 hits. All from an unsupported seated position in less than 10 seconds. She stood up and set the rifle back on the bench. The skepticism in the corporal's eyes had been replaced by a look of profound, soul-crushing humility. Precision isn't about the badge on your chest, Sierra said, her green eyes scanning the group. It's about the math in your head and the ice in your blood. I'm not here to teach you how to pull a trigger. Any monkey with a finger can do that. I'm here to teach you how to live with the choices you make after the trigger is pulled. She paced the line, her shadow long on the dirt. A sniper is a guardian. You are the space between a target and a tragedy. You will carry every round you fire for the rest of your lives. If you want glory, go join the Rangers. If you want to be a ghost, listen to me. Later that evening, Sierra sat on the back porch of the small bungalow she and Grant had rented outside the base. The crickets were a loud, rhythmic pulse in the grass. Grant came out, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He sat beside her, his hand finding hers in the dark. He had taken a position as a training coordinator for the infantry school. He looked younger here, the stress of the forgotten command at Sentinel replaced by a sense of purpose. How was the first class? He asked. They're young, Grant, so young. I look at them and I see Danny Reeves. I see the kids who don't know that the Phantom isn't a hero, she's just a survivor. You're changing that, Sierra, Grant said. You're teaching them how to be survivors too. That's the legacy. Sierra reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was Danny Reeves, grinning in the dust of Afghanistan, holding a stale MRE cracker like it was a 5-star meal. She had finally taken it out of the box. I called Silas today, she said. He's out of the hospital, walking with a cane. He said he's thinking about opening a long-range school in Montana for civilians. He wants me to come up and guest lecture next summer. And I told him I'd have to check my schedule. I've got a lot of ghosts to train before then. She looked at the photo of Danny one last time, then tucked it into the frame of her dope card notebook. She wasn't running from the memory anymore. She was using it to build a shield for the next generation. Grant? Yeah, Shadow? I took a picture today. Not of a target, just a red-tailed hawk on the range fence. Grant smiled, leaning his head against hers. Was the light right? The light was perfect, Sierra said. In the distance, the muffled thud of night fire exercises echoed from the mortar pits. To anyone else, it was the sound of war. To Sierra Vance, it was the sound of a world being watched over. She was no longer the ghost of Kabul, haunted by a no-fire order. She was the instructor of Fort Moore, the guardian of the gate, and the woman who knew that the most important distance a sniper ever calculates isn't the yardage to a target. It's the distance between the person they were and the person they have the courage to become. The wind died down, the red clay cooled, and for the first time in 6 years, the ghost was finally at peace.